good morning or good afternoon or good night. Maybe some people are still in the nighttime. I'm Pier Vittorio Aureli. I'm the director of the PhD program at the Architectural Association. And today I'm welcoming you to our year symposium, which will take place actually today from now until 6 o'clock. I just want to before I start actually to introduce the topic, I really would like to thank the AEA, our alma mater, the Architectural Association, for making this symposium possible. I really want to thank actually our speakers, and I will introduce them actually in my presentation. Especially because, of course, to work and produce research in the conditions in which we are, it's not very easy. So I'm extremely happy that they agreed to participate and to really make this symposium what, in my opinion, looks a very promising contribution to the production of architectural knowledge. So I will now start actually my introduction, just some housekeeping rule before I start. Please keep your microphones muted when you are not actually speaking, so to avoid actually background noises. We will have actually quite a lot of time for questions and comments. We will have actually after each presentation, excluding actually mine, so I would not have the Q&A after my presentation. I would immediately move to the next presentation, but after each speaker presentation, we will have 10 minutes for Q&A and comments. But then after each session, the morning session and the afternoon session, we will have actually an hour of debate each, let's say, for each post-session debate. So I am very much encourage you to, of course, participate. This is actually a PhD symposium, so in a way, I really hope our PhD cohort will interact actually with our speakers, but the conversation is really open to all the participants of this, let's say, virtual room. Perhaps you can actually you can mention that you want to say something in the chat, and then we'll actually give you the podium to speak. So I hope you will stay there actually behind the screen for the whole symposium. I know that it's a challenge to follow lectures and especially a symposium through this medium of Zoom, but perhaps I would say that especially in those times, focus and attention are really necessary. And I really think that the work we will present to you today really deserve your focus and attention. I will now actually share my screen. Just a moment. Can you see something over there? Perfect. Okay. So the title of the symposium, as you might know, is God is in the Detail, Labor, Architecture, and the Politics of Construction. And this symposium is a follow-up of another symposium the PhD program had organized actually 5 years ago on the topic of labor. Labor, of course, in relationship with the production of architecture. It was a very important symposium for us because it was a culmination of a research that many of us have been developed in the last, I would say, 10 years or even more on the relationship between architecture and labor. And so the symposium was a first attempt to gather not only ourselves within the PhD program, but also friends and colleagues from other places to discuss how actually to understand the issue of labor through the lens of our discipline and our profession. This symposium actually for us was a very landmark event. You can actually still look to the lectures and presentations on the YouTube channel of the Architectural Association. I'm also very happy that some of the speakers that were present in that symposium are present even today. So I hope this will really continue actually a conversation across these two events. But at the end of that symposium, realized that in a way the symposium had a lot of emphasis on the labor of design. So this was actually really a very important aspect. So we were focusing a lot on the issue of the labor of the architects. And of course, this really resonated with the increasing consciousness of the very harsh and difficult conditions in which we as architects find ourselves in the way in which our profession is organized, especially young architects or even not so young architects actually are increasingly feeling the alienation and also the way in which the architectural profession is being increasingly proletarized in a way. And so in a way, the symposium was very much trying to understand what were the historical roots, the origin of this, let's say, problematic condition of our profession. But of course, something that was left a little bit behind, with few exceptions, of course, was another aspect of labor and architecture, which is, of course, is the labor of construction. I would argue that with very few notable exceptions, some of them very well represented actually in our symposium, the labor of construction has been a fundamental blind spot in much architectural theory and even in critical theory, the theory that really tried to actually uncover let's say, the very factors and conditions that regulate and organize the production of architecture in terms of construction. As I said, there are very few exceptions to this situation. And here I really want to mention the pioneering work of Katie Lloyd Thomas, who actually will be with us, Linda Clark and Christine Wall. Actually, I have to say that their work has been, for me, one of the most interesting approach to this problem. And I'm really happy that this a very important point of view will be present in our symposium. I also want to mention the work of Pedro Fioriantes, a very important Brazilian architect and theorist who actually recently has really discussed the problematic relationship between design and the labor of construction. But in general, the labor of construction is really a blind spot. And I would say even more in architectural education. Of course, we have, as schools, we often offer occasionally modules or units or, let's say, courses that focus on the issue of construction. I have to also say that we have a very good course at the Architectural Association with our colleagues that teach technical studies. But somehow the labor of construction is seldom, I would say, understood as one of the most important sides of the politics of architecture. So this is actually why we choose to title our symposium The Politics of Construction, since we believe that in the way construction of architecture is organized is often very much driven not simply by pragmatic or let's say functional issues, but often as a way to counter a fundamental subject at stake in the production of the building of architecture, which is actually the builders, the people who actually materially make architecture a concrete reality. And this is exactly something that many histories of architecture, many narratives about architecture, starting already from antiquity, have tried to erase. In a way, construction remains a kind of, and especially the subjects that make construction possible, remain something really in the background. So the symposium is really an attempt, therefore, to let's say, reintroduce this issue really as a theoretical problem of architecture. This is our goal. Of course, we are very much aware that the selection of case studies is very limited, yet I would argue it's also a very interesting selection, but it's very limited because, of course, construction cannot be narrowed to to one specific process. There are many cultures of building, many cultures of construction. And in fact, we believe that this research, this interest will develop further and perhaps will include many other cultures and not only those that are very, let's say, more close to us, where we are, at least virtually at the moment, which is actually London. So I really want to insist that what we are presenting to you is a work in progress. It's not really there is no any ambition to offer a kind of encyclopedic panorama of the relationship, the politics of construction. It's just the beginning to gather knowledge and also to showcase to you those who actually have been already working on this topic since actually a long time. Of course, from the sedentarization of society's architecture, it was always a labor-intensive activity, and it still is one of the most labor-intensive activity, where in fact the organization of the labor force has always played an extremely important role. And we have actually anthropological and archaeological evidence that in many cultures, not just the artifact itself, but the very labor of building was often considered a fundamental ritual of communities, and often a way through which institutions of power were making manifest their, let's say, political governance over communities. So this governance was not just represented by the artifact itself, but especially by the building of those artifacts. In a way, building in many ancient cultures, not only actually in the West, but also in other parts of the world, was a highly skilled process. Most of the people involved in construction were highly skilled laborers, but somehow the fact that these workers were working under some very clear direction that would culminate in the formation of these large-scale monuments made clear that there was a plan, there was a project which addressed precisely the institutions of power that were promoting these structures. It's not by chance that from very early on we have evidence that those buildings were often the outcome of plans, of projects. And in fact, the idea of the project, the idea of the plan has always been a fundamental institution of power. That somehow is able to coordinate, to organize the labor force, and making actually the process of building one of the most fundamental, let's say, representation of statecraft, as it's evident in the famous statue of King Gudea, who actually has on its lap a plan of his own temple. And the plan really, what we consider the fundamental architectural, let's say, medium becomes really a tool to represent power, the power to organize this large, vast pool of laborers who were meant to actually execute this plan. And of course, it's exactly in this context, already actually since antiquity, precisely because building requires this intensive organization of the building site, that we start to see a split between those who actually are supposed to coordinate the planning of architecture, the architect, and the builders. And of course, what we see here, it's something that will be fundamental in many societies and culture, is a split between intellectual and manual labor. And of course, we know that this split between intellectual and manual labor is one of the most foundational acts of our discipline. In a way, the discipline of architecture is really the outcome of this division of labor between those who actually think and plan and those who actually are supposed to be obedient to this thinking and planning by the architect. But of course, behind the architect, there is the institution that finance and promotes the, let's say, building activity. And we shouldn't forget that somehow the disciplinary autonomy of the architect was very much instrumental to the patron, who would in fact use the architect to coordinate and to reduce the workforce to the rule actually of the project. Perhaps the most controversial definition of what is the role of the architect that really emerged from this division of labor between, let's say, intellectual and manual labor was given by Leon Battista Alberti in his important treatise De Reedificatoria, The Art of Building. In the prologue, he defines the architect in a very radical and controversial way. He writes, before I go any further, I should explain exactly who I mean by an architect. For it is not a carpenter that I would have you to compare to the greatest exponents of other disciplines. The carpenter is but an instrument in the hands of the architect. Him I consider the architect who by sure and wonderful reason and method knows both how to devise through his own mind and energy and to realize construction whatever can be most beautifully fitted out of the noble needs of people by the movement of weights and the joining of massing of bodies. Here there are a few things to note in this striking definition of who is the architect according to Alberti. First of all, when Alberti has to define the architect, the first things he does is to not define the architect, but to immediately define the architect per via negativa by saying the architect is not a carpenter, the architect is not a builder. Second, he's actually referring the architect as something that works through his mind. Nevertheless, his way of working through his mind is directly linked to construction. So for Alberti, the conceptualization of architecture is not removing the architect from the building site, but is reinforcing the subordination of the building site to the mind of the architect and therefore to the agency of the patron. So somehow it's very important to say that what happened in Renaissance is not simply an abstraction of architecture from construction, but is to link this abstraction of architecture from construction to the very physical effort of building. And in fact, it's not by chance that Alberti titled his book not like Vitruvius, De Architectura, architecture, but De Reedificatoria, the art of building, which is exactly what the architect is meant to now direct through actually his design. Of course, Alberti was not inventing anything new. This split between intellectual and manual labor was one of the fundamental aspects that emerged already in medieval Europe. One of the building sites in which this process becomes very radical and evident is in the building of cathedrals, which is actually one of the largest building enterprise that happened in Europe between the 13th and the 15th century. These buildings actually were, of course, not only big, but they were also involving a huge amount of resources. A huge amount of people actually were involved in these building sites. We know by a lot of historical evidence that the organization of the labor force in building cathedrals was almost a Fordist factory with a very strong division of labor, which actually was causing a lot of conflicts. So in a way, cathedrals appear to us as this very cohesive body of architecture, but in fact, their construction was often the site of conflicts between different actors involved in its construction. But the most important thing is to say that the Gothic cathedral became really one of the fundamental sites of the division of labor at the building site. So it's in fact here that we start to have a series of actors hierarchically organized: the architect, the parler, who is actually the person that mediates between the architect and the builders at the building site, the master mason, the stone cutter, but also unskilled workers. I mean, people who are supposed to take care of the building site, to clean, to move materials, and of course, especially the workers at the quarry. We shouldn't forget also that it's within the building of these cathedrals that for the first time wage labor becomes a mass phenomenon within actually medieval Europe. But of course, the most fundamental split and conflict that happened within the building of cathedrals is an increasing conflict between skilled workers and unskilled workers, because in fact, the site is organized in a way that for one skilled workers, more or less, there are 5 unskilled workers. So there is a clear politics of building a kind of assembly line, of construction methods, where in fact the number of unskilled workers dramatically increase. And what mediates the whole process, of course, is the plan of the architect, who actually becomes the person responsible to interface the patron or the institutions that were financing these buildings and actually the builder. So it is exactly between this very conflictual reality that in fact the modern Western and of course after global architect and its professional mandate it's produced for the first time. And of course we know that the consequence of this is a history of downgrading of manual labor, a downgrading actually of building which is less and less, much more and more subordinated to design. Design actually, especially building techniques, become an instrument to dominate, to constantly keep in check, let's say, the building process, even details, like, for example, ornamentations, features like the orders are in fact a grammar that is meant to exclude the improvisation and the, let's say, interpretation of the builders at the building site. And of course, this process really culminated, especially with the Industrial Revolution, where in fact many building techniques that are introduced during this time were often a reaction to the way in which it was possible to organize in the most efficient and profitable way the labor force and avoid actually conflicts at the building site. And of course, this has been the construction industry has been one of the most important sites also of worker struggle, defending actually their rights not only to let's say, built in a safe way, but also to try to represent actually their labor within the production of architecture, when architecture, the way it's built, the way it appears in public space really makes any effort to erase actually the traces of their important and fundamental contribution. So in a way, this is exactly a bit the framework in which we would like to put forward the seminar. Of course, we are all architects, needless to say. Well, not all of us, but I would say the majority actually our this discussion we are undoing to a certain extent our professional mandate. We are opening a Pandora's box that hopefully will really help us to rethink what is actually our professional mandate, not only towards architecture, but also towards society at large, and especially by bringing back the builder and the constructor and the labor necessary to realize architecture to the fore. I just want to quickly go and present you the speakers of today, and just as a teaser about what they're going to tell us and how they will fit in the framework of our symposium. We'll start with Maria Sherazad Giudici, who will tell us about Roman construction techniques, ancient Roman construction techniques in relationship to issues of labor. We will then move to Brazil, and Davide Sacconi will introduce us to the extremely important work of Arquitectura Nova, very important collective of architects that really try actually to somehow criticize the role of the architectural project in the construction and building process of architecture. We will then move again to England, and we will learn from Georgios Eftaxiopoulos how the Crystal Palace was, among other things, also a building instrumentalized by those who actually promoted it to the-skill the labor force through actually very intensive process of prefabrication and production of architectural elements. And we will conclude actually the morning session with Katie Lloyd Thomas, who will talk about proprietary specification and the rise of building products in the interwar Britain, a very interesting topic, very seldom discussed, but fundamental really also in the formation of the role of the architect in relationship to issues of building and labor. After the break, we will resume our conversation with Hugh Strange, who will introduce us to the work of, very interesting work of Walter Sigal, very Berlin born, but London-based architect, who actually developed an extremely interesting technique of self-building that to this day remain one of the most radical contribution to this, let's say, way of building, let's say, beside contractors and architects. Then we will move to another very interesting architect, Eladio Dieste, who also tried to incorporate issues of labor and construction in his work. And the presenter will be Federico Garcia Lammers, who actually has worked a lot on this issue of labor, architecture, and construction. We'll then stay in the Americas, but we will go north, and we will actually learn from Paul Preisner the history of the balloon frame, the history and reality of one of the most widespread techniques used for the construction of houses and also all kinds of buildings in US with the American superficial. Then we will return to London with Christine Wall, who will tell us about the construction stories behind actually brutalist architecture, which of course one of the most iconic architecture today, but precisely for that reason, that an architecture that has often hide between this very glamorous, let's say, presentation, the very intensive role of builders in its production. And we will conclude actually with and I forgot the slide, of course. I'm really sorry for that. We will conclude with Kadamari Baxi, who actually will tell us about one of the most important initiative of advocacy in labor and construction with her collective who builds architecture that we share with, of course, other members. And I think that will be a very important conclusion because it will move our focus from more, let's say, historical and theoretical discussions to really the activism that is beginning to start to develop around issues of labor and construction. I really apologize that for some reason, the slide with the title of her presentation disappeared from my slideshow, but actually that's it from my side. This was a very quick just teaser to now the main part of the event, which is actually our speaker's presentation.